If you really want to enjoy the story, I recommend finding a quiet place and putting on your headphones to fully immerse yourself in the experience. Introduction. This story or autobiography, or as you will later read, I will not classify it under any specific category. It is not about a label imposed by society or an isolated idea apart from others. Although classification is important in my community and one of the essential tools for good care before expressing your opinion or even being its listener, it must have a classification that can articulate its name, assess beliefs or thoughts before compelling you. I was born in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the summer of the 70s after my parents had been married for 7 years. I was a source of joy and delight for the entire family, as my mother told me, and I attended primary school at your home, along with some of my children. Before completing my first year, I started traveling with them to the United States when my father pursued his studies to obtain a bachelor's degree. So I grew up in a vastly different environment, one to which I would return later after finishing my studies. I grew up in a foreign environment and learned English before Arabic, which became my first language. I lived like any Western child, living his daily life under the shadow of the largest and most influential country in the world. My childhood journey began through kindergarten, eating fast food from McDonald's and Burger King, the beloved American meals. Our fascination with Disney games and shows was in sync, and as a child, I understood nothing of life. I remember only what happened when I fell off my bike and was taken to the children's hospital. There was another world for me that still terrified me with my ignorance while life flowed on its path. It was common for a child to fall to the ground during class after days of eating fries and half a liter of Pepsi. It was not unusual, as we had grown accustomed to patience. When I turned 12, I started to understand the world with all its small perspectives. I began to love school trips and got used to listening to lectures from my English teacher every time. When I heard the banter and complex musical series, thoughts evaporated when I only contemplated the science. I forgot Arabic, which became a lower rank in my life, overwhelmed with all its updates. I even forgot the most memorable memory of my childhood, which was that the park where my siblings and I played was not wet, but rather dripping with the remnants of rain that had reduced its heat and evaporated into the air before our return to the country. The most frequent question directed at me was, "What is your name?" And there were looks of disapproval from some of those present in those gatherings because I was speaking in the language of the infidels as they saw it, and they didn't hide their discontent. They would often caution my father as if I were on the verge of straying from the righteous path. But thank God my father wasn't one to fight what he didn't understand, nor did he sugarcoat his principles. He raised me with those values, so he simply ignored those comments and paid them no mind. Within a few months, I learned Arabic through practice and listening, but I never forgot my first language. I was deeply yearning to hear and speak that language, which had been such a significant part of my childhood. My first step back into that world I missed so much was through watching Aramco TV, a channel dedicated to the employees of the Arabian American Oil Company, later known as the Saudi Arabian Oil Company, ARAMCO. The channel was broadcast from Dhahran in the Eastern Province, aimed at Americans and other foreigners as a remedy for their homesickness. I was among those who longed for home and followed that channel closely. It became a window through which I could look out at the world I had left behind so abruptly. I would watch it until it went off the air at night. It was as if my return from abroad to my homeland had paused the process of embedding that culture in my mind, only for it to resume after I started following the channel and its programs centered around my first culture. I was never drawn to the local culture, not out of disdain or arrogance, but because it's like an instinctive attachment to another culture, much like a child who, after being raised by his mother until the age of 5, discovers that he is adopted and that his biological mother, who gave birth to him, is coming to take him away from the arms of the mother who raised him. The child begins to cry, not out of rejection for his biological mother, but out of attachment to the mother who nurtured and embraced him, who was with him in his first steps in this world. The programs on Aramco TV were like a photo album of that mother who raised me and from whom I was separated after I had grown emotionally and intellectually attached to her. I would flip through that album every day, longing to see her, even though that mother wasn't Muslim and wore a cross. This is why many people don't understand me today when I defend my first mother, or rather my first culture, which is often labeled as immoral and corrupt. Who among us would accept hearing their mother insulted and stand by silently, listening to others accuse her of the worst things, even if some of those accusations were true? That's why I defended her in many discussions, despite the labels that were attached to me for doing so. The day I discovered reading, the television broke down. I was about 10 years old, and in that pivotal moment of my life, I felt lost. It was as if my vision had been taken from me. I wasn't like the other kids who played soccer passionately in the street or rode their bikes from alley to alley, gathering life experiences through direct interaction with their peers. I had my own world, a world that was thrown into disarray when that television broke. I went to my father, pleading with him to fix the TV and restore my only window to the world to its former state. It was the beginning of my day, and after school, the television was like a magical box that delivered doses of excitement and thrill, something I always craved. At that time, I didn't have any hobbies to entertain myself or to fill the free time that always seemed to empty quickly. Filling that time was a constant obsession of mine. Although my father responded quickly, my hopes were dashed when he returned that evening and informed me that it would take 3 days to repair the device. That day, a strong curiosity grew within me to find something else to occupy my time until my window to the world was restored. I began searching around the house, hoping to find something to entertain me during those desolate 3 days. My search led me to the upper floor of our home, and there I approached a room I had never thought of entering before. My father's library. I can't quite describe how I felt when I opened the door to the library that day, but it was as if I had discovered a hidden treasure buried in our backyard. The treasure was a collection of books, magazines, tapes, and documents that my father had gathered during his years of study in America. They were all meticulously arranged on a large glass cabinet, carefully organized. A reading table, like the ones you find in meeting rooms, stood at the center with a globe perched on top, and in the middle, a leather swivel chair. I felt as though the world was in my hands. Although the books, magazines, and tapes were all in English, I eagerly devoured them. I fell in love with reading and listening to the songs of 1960s and 70s artists like the Beatles, the Bee Gees, and Boney M. while flipping through my first issue of Time magazine. I was there, yet I was here. In that library, I found a magic carpet that whisked me around the world through paper and the melodies of some music that turned the pages into a gateway to countless adventures. It only took seconds for me to be transported back to my first culture. I felt fortunate, knowing that most children my age would not have been able to benefit from this great treasure without the language skills I possessed, the cultural and intellectual grounding that had been instilled in me, and the freedom I was given to explore that library. I finished reading my first encyclopedia in just a few days, even though I was only 10 years old. I delved into subjects I didn't fully understand at the time because my father loved collecting books on every topic. He even had a special collection locked away in a black diplomatic case, which I managed to open several months later. After the 3 days had passed, the television was back in the house, but I didn't pay it nearly as much attention as before. I had found something far richer and more fulfilling. So I sailed through the vast oceans of that library without pause until I graduated from elementary school. At that time, I didn't find the school curricula compelling, which had a negative impact on my academic performance. I wasn't unintelligent, just uninterested. I didn't have many friends during that period of my life, not because I was antisocial, but because I wasn't drawn to children my age. Their topics of conversation were worlds apart from those that could spark even the slightest interest in me. I saw their interests as extremely superficial, despite my repeated attempts to integrate with them. During that phase, I started reading local literature, but it didn't captivate me either due to the difference in style and depth compared to Western works. However, I was intrigued by literature, and I found myself reading a lot of works by Ahmed Shawki. I'm not sure why, but he was the poet who most captivated my attention and drew me in with his writing. As the days passed, I lived with a mind that was different from those around me. Not necessarily smarter, but certainly different. My daily and consistent reading of the books in my father's library was a major factor in shaping my personality, and in what could be considered an early mental maturation. I loved analyzing characters because there were so many diverse examples around me to study. I remember that when I was about 12 years old, I had a stomach problem that caused me frequent pain. None of the doctors and specialists my father took me to could find a remedy, and despite my mother's concern for me, modern medicine offered no solution to my chronic condition. My mother eventually decided to visit a sheikh who specialized in reciting over people, even though she was not inclined to take that unknown route. Not out of disbelief in the Quran or its ability, by God's will, to heal people, but because of her skepticism and lack of trust in those who practiced such recitations. However, she eventually gave in to the pressure and insistence of her relatives, who highly recommended this virtuous sheikh. After much insistence from my mother, we went with my father to see this man, who was known as the Omani Sheikh, to begin the treatment sessions with him. My father would drive us to an area filled with mud brick houses, and my mother and I would walk the rest of the way on foot through dilapidated old houses. It was a new environment for me at the time, with its streets, its unique smell. During the first visit, I didn't fully grasp where we were going. But as the visits became more frequent, I started to look forward to them. For some reason, I found those mud brick houses fascinating. We would wait for the sheikh in a small room filled with women and children, and it was rare to see a man among them. The waiting periods were long during our initial visits, until my mother figured out how the place operated: through money. Once she understood this mechanism, we were granted VIP passes for every visit. Money quickly exchanged hands with everyone who helped us reach the sheikh, and after several checkpoints, I would finally sit before him for just 5 minutes. During that time, my mother would try to explain my condition hastily. Worry etched on her face while the sheikh sat with his eyes closed, placing his hand on my head, muttering inaudible words. I would watch him with a mix of fear and curiosity, and the session would usually end with him spitting in my face or into a bottle of oil or water before we hurriedly left, as if fleeing the scene of a crime. My mother continued to take me to the sheikh, and the spitting sessions persisted until she suddenly stopped going. Honestly, I had grown accustomed to those visits, which offered me a rare chance to leave the house. I wasn't one of those kids who was allowed to go out much, so those treatment appointments were a welcome change. A few weeks after we stopped visiting the sheikh, I asked my mother, "Why don't we go to the sheikh anymore, Mom?" She responded with something that only made me laugh years later when I was older. She spoke with a sense of sorrow. "The police have arrested him." I could never have imagined that my mother, who was well educated and had traveled to more than 20 countries around the world, would end up taking her own son to a man to have him spit in his face and pay him a handsome amount for it. This situation, when I recalled it one day, stirred a question in my restless mind. Why? Why did my mother do that? Why did she go to that charlatan who drenched me with his oils and saliva? I could find only one answer: fear. Yes, fear. Fear stripped her of her reason and logic, leaving her defenseless. It was fear that was the weapon of that man, used to extort money and sometimes even the dignity of people. No one dared to confront him because he wore a cloak that granted him all the authority and immunity he needed: religion. This issue lingered in my mind until I reached the age of 20, becoming a focal point of my concern. I began to observe those around me and put the theory of fear to the test repeatedly. The theory I hold is merely speculative. I tried to explain to people through logical discussion that the blind trust they give to those who cloak themselves in religious garb contradicts the instinct of caution and fear that is fundamental to their survival. However, the impact of the beard, the short garment, and the scent of oud was stronger than both me and my logic. Despite this, I hope to bring about a change in the prevailing mindset towards those who parade as religious scholars. Yet upon reaching university, I discovered that my society suffered from a fundamental misunderstanding of the essence of understanding. In other words, there was a piety that preceded a person's ability to speak, and a piety that preceded their interactions with you. I didn't grasp this system and had never read about it in any book before. I adapted to my society by clinging to my own concepts and principles, and I mastered the art of ignoring those who chose to remain ignorant. Some criticized my references to Einstein because he was Jewish and accused me of foolishness for admiring Hitler's Nazi ideology. The prevailing norm here was that anything outside the geographical boundaries of our nation should be dealt with only with contempt and regret. They were the lost ones, and we were the saved. Even my friendships with followers of other religions and different sects were seen by some as a grave betrayal of the organization that would enter paradise through its widest gates. I do not deny that I tried to adopt this mindset at a certain period in my life as a means of adaptation and exploring new ideas, but I was unable to because my intellectual demands were greater. I was accused of heresy and disdain for religion multiple times by several self-styled scholars, and these accusations were not truly religious in nature. I then began to think deeply and reached a personal conviction. An idiot is like someone naked before others and will cover and conceal himself in any way possible to hide his foolishness. Some choose silence, which I respect. Others choose to attack you so that people will turn their attention to you and away from their own exposed inadequacies. Unfortunately, this is the situation with many of the foolish people in my society. Some confuse ignorance with stupidity, thinking that ignorance is a flaw similar to stupidity. They do not realize that we are all ignorant about something in one way or another, and only God knows all knowledge. Ignorance is simply a lack of knowledge, but stupidity is a deficiency in the ability to comprehend knowledge, and this is far more dangerous. At that stage of my life, at the height of my thirst for knowledge, the course of my life changed forever. I did not share what happened to me with anyone because I could not find an explanation that any rational mind in this era would accept. To be clear from the outset, I do not seek acceptance or rejection from anyone. I will recount what I went through merely for the sake of documenting the timeline, hoping that one day I do not seek acceptance or rejection from anyone. I will recount what I went through merely for the sake of documenting the timeline, hoping that one day after my death, people may view what I have written in the same way they once viewed the works of those who first proposed that the earth is round. Works that were burned along with their authors and whose true nature was only recognized after many centuries. What I will recount in the following pages, events, stories, and narratives, I will not ask anyone to believe, nor will I claim it is the absolute truth to protect myself from the lash of ignorant criticism. Nor will I label it as purely fictional to avoid diminishing a significant part of my life. Instead, I will simply say that it is just a collection of stories. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to engage with us by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. And turn on the notification bell to get alerts for the full story and the exciting moments ahead. I'm sure you'll love it and stay excited for every moment.